Good afternoon. Welcome to today's edition of the Coal Scene. I'm Chris Hamilton and I'll be your host for the next half hour. Joining me in the studio today is Mr. Jason Bostic, who's the Junior Vice President for the West Virginia Coal Association. Jason's going to talk to us a little bit about the EPA's action on recent action on the Clean Power Plan, and then we're going to talk a little bit about markets and some of the things going on within the coal industry during this period of time. Jason, thanks for coming by.
Thanks.
Appreciate your willingness to join me on the program here today. EPA's Clean Power Plan. Boy, I know a little bit about it, but it comes at a time when this industry, when the coal industry was trying to deal with a lot of challenges that it had never seen or experienced before, and comes in the wake of a lot of bankruptcies in the industry, a prolonged period of where the industry was on a downward spiral, losing production, losing employees. Then it's looking down the barrel of a program designed to remove upwards of 25-30% of the coal being consumed around the country. Couldn't be good for the coal industry.
No, Chris, and as you know, it was just a little background. The Clean Power Plan was the fanciful term assigned for the carbon emission reduction targets that were established by the Obama administration under the Clean Air Act. And it was for this particular part of the Clean Power Plan was for existing coal-fired power plants. And it established emission limits probably just unachievable at existing coal-fired power plants. So there were only two ways to achieve the limits had they been allowed to go into effect. That was through the outright reduction of coal-fired electricity. In other words, taking it out of the market, or through a very ambitious plan of energy savings, energy efficiency, where the end consumers of power would have reduced their demand commensurate with the carbon emission targets in the Clean Power Plan. But ultimately what we think, and what most other groups around the country, folks more involved in the actual transmission and consumption of power, believe it was going to cause a determined or a predetermined overall shift in the electrical market. A lot more reliance, not because of market incentives or the low cost of generating the power, but it would have driven the power market to renewables. And renewables, whether it's wind or solar, they've got their own set of complications. Reliability, the intermittent nature of the sources. So it really would have probably turned the nation's electric market inside out, even worse than the mercury control regulations had done in about 2010 to 2015 by closing about 600 coal-fired units across the country.
I remember reading something early on that was produced, made public by the United Mine Workers. It was a study they did, and it showed that, I want to get my numbers right here, but I believe it showed that by 2020, which all of a sudden is around the corner. I mean, 2020 is 2 years away.
That's right.
10, 15 years ago, it sounded like something, pretty far off in the future, but I think when this rule was first proposed 2-3 years ago now, maybe a little longer, 2020 was, 5-6 years down the road. But it seems to me, I recall reading that the United Mine Workers study showed that there was going to be an immediate loss of about 75,000 jobs. And then, later on, 20, 25, 20, maybe 30, there'd be another 75 where you'd lose 150,000 jobs that deal with, that come directly out of the mining industry, the indirect jobs, transportation. I think it was also, that their partner in this was the utility workers.
Yes.
Because you'd see a lot of coal-fired plants, huge plants that we have, that employ a couple hundred people at each one. Then you have all the transloading of coal, barges, to rail. So, I mean, that's an amazing number. That has stuck with me that, and all for what? Just for such a real small percentage of CO 2 being removed from the atmosphere.
Yeah, because I mean, as the mine worker study found, it would have, I think, at its full implementation, as the Clean Power Plan is phased in over 3 phases, it would have decimated the domestic coal market. I mean, the states that, unlike West Virginia, that just mine utility coal or thermal coal, like Illinois, Indiana, and Wyoming, it would have completely eliminated their market eventually as it was fully implemented. Had there not been a new technology developed that we could hang on the side of a power plant that allowed us to remove the carbon emissions, and as you know, we don't have that yet.
Well, and the other argument that you heard was, you know, we're going to be again exporting more American jobs, more West Virginia jobs, more Central App jobs to overseas, because there's X amount of coal being consumed in this world. You know, let's talk about the global side of things. You know, China and India is using 6-7 times more coal than we are, and you know, if we're going to slow the you know, coal production and coal consumption domestically here, it's going to impact our export as well.
That's right.
And so, you know, they'll be ramping up production of coal in these other countries that we're currently competing with to fill that void.
Yes.
So,
and because you would have pushed, I think more so than you've seen in the past, the Clean Power Plan would have pushed energy-intensive industries, heavy manufacturing, steel making. You would have pushed them more and more offshore, because the price of electricity, I think, because of the Clean Power Plan's designed reliance on intermittent resources, wind and solar, would have driven the price of electricity, I think, through the roof. And the industries that rely on electricity to do their business would have migrated offshore even more than what we've seen over the past 30, 40 years.
so EPA, just to kind of put this in you know, real-time status here, EPA has announced that they are stopping this regulation from going further, and more so, they intend on repealing the regulation that was proposed and actually finalized but never implemented under the last administration, under the Obama administration.
Yeah, almost as immediately as the regulations were issued by EPA, the final regulations, there was a coalition of about 29 states, including the state of West Virginia, and actually our Attorney General, Patrick Morrisey, led that coalition, went before the U.S. Supreme Court and asked for a stay of the Clean Power Plan's implementation, pending the ultimate outcome of what was, you know, multiple legal challenges to how involved EPA could be in the power generation market versus control of pollution or control of alleged pollution from a power plant. So the regulation was stayed by the Supreme Court. The new administration, the Trump administration's EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, who was involved in the litigation against the Clean Power Plan when he was the Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma, I think he probably understands the legal infirmities of the Clean Power Plan better than anybody at EPA. And after reviewing the information, reviewing the administrative record, and I think he can see that the Clean Power Plan gave EPA a role not in the Clean Air Act, but more in the movement, delivery, generation, and pricing of electricity, a role that I don't think Congress ever had envisioned for them. That's when Congress created the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that's the regulatory body that's supposed to control the interstate generation of electricity. So I think Administrator Pruitt made the right decision and has proposed to rescind and repeal the regulation and eventually replace it with something else.
You mentioned it was stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court. I believe that was one of Judge Scalia's last decisions before he passed unexpectedly.
I believe it was. It may have been the last one.
May have been his last one, and so in some ways, you know, you could say that EPA today is following, you know, the trail that was initiated by the U.S. Supreme Court in that major decision.
Yes.
You know, before we leave this subject, you know, the electric utility industry has just made remarkable gains over the past 15, 20, 25 years, cleaning up the constituents that come out of coal-fired electric generation. It seems like I read something where, when you compare, the clean air stream today that's coming out of coal-fired plants with that same generation emission from 30 years ago, I think it's safe to say that the industry has, cleaned up 90+% of all the airborne constituents. And, I pointed out, here we are in Charleston, West Virginia. I mean, we are just at ground zero of a major coal-producing state. And you go outside on any given day and you see a little bit of steam coming out from these, or water vapor from these power plants. You don't see smoke, you don't see airborne constituents. It's just amazing, and that came at a price of a couple $2 billion. And that's going to continue well into the future. I mean, that's just what we do as an industry, and what we expect and demand as a culture.
Yeah, I agree, Chris. And the other thing, when we talk about the reduction of traditional pollutants, sulfur dioxide, and NOx, and particulate matter from a mercury
sulfur
from a coal-fired power plant, that is a testimony, I think, to the success of the Clean Air Act and its traditional implementation measures, where power companies could make decisions to super scrub or implement pollution controls that were above and beyond what were required for that individual facility, but in turn build credits for maybe a smaller facility or an older facility, but continue to keep the smaller facility online using the credits that were built up in the bigger operation. And the previous administration, the Obama administration, jettisoned that model, and I think that was a mistake, because the Clean Air Act has been enormously successful based on that market-driven principle to allow the power generators to make the investments where it made sense and then build up their own credits or buy them off a credit trading market to offset emissions from other facilities where the pollution control deployment wasn't possible.
Well, the whole characterization that they gave this for the name, the Clean Power Plan, was a little bit of a misnomer, because it wasn't intended to clean up the constituents from the emissions that you mentioned. This was designed exclusively to deal with CO2.
It was, and probably the more accurate description would be the costly power plant.
The costly power plant, yeah, without question. You mentioned that EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. We have a lot of miners watching this program out there, and you hear a lot of discussion about whether President Trump is fulfilling some of his obligations to coal, or some of the promises he made when he was campaigning. I think there's been remarkable success already that's come from the Trump administration with respect to trying to help this industry.
Couldn't agree more, Chris. It's so refreshing. As you know, the only public hearing that was held so far, or to date, that has been held on the Clean Power Plan repeal was convened here in our state capital in Charleston a couple of weeks ago. And such a dramatic reversal from the previous administration, which refused to hold hearings when it proposed the Clean Power Plan, not only in Charleston, but in most coal-producing areas. They stayed away from those areas. But I think everything that we see from EPA, obviously it could move faster, never move fast enough to undo some of the damage that's been done, but I think it's very promising. And even if the individual actions aren't coming quick enough, the fact that you have a federal regulatory agency that will at least entertain other possibilities, instead of looking at an agenda seeing a discussion about the coal industry or the individual production problems that we're having, and just dismissing that outright. That in and of itself was refreshing. To see the EPA regional administrator from Region 3 in Philadelphia sit in Charleston and offer comments to the media about the illegality of the Clean Power Plan, that's not only refreshing, I didn't think I'd ever see that.
No, and it's just, and that same mindset and competent individual also sits ahead of some of the other agencies now. that were all appointed by President Trump. And, these are individuals that are, all committed to the task at hand, are extraordinarily qualified, but also recognize the balance that we have to achieve. I mean, they're not real zealots that want to go out there and, and close a business or close an industry down from a punitive standpoint. It seems like we're transitioning away from that. And, these individuals are just top-notch, appointees, and they're running the ship in a very positive kind of way.
And again, trying to recognize the balance that Congress tried to achieve, whether it's the Clean Air Act or the Surface Mining Act or the Clean Water Act.
They're factoring in the economics of the business that they're regulating.
Yes.
It seems like, and which nobody, I've not heard anybody oppose that.
No.
I mean, really, except you have a few that do, but for the most part, I think mainstream America, want to see these jobs continue, want to see us making things and producing energy here, and protecting the environment at the same time.
Yeah, and understanding, Chris, that we can do both. But when you drive the regulatory world so far either way, that typically results in a mistake. And for the previous 8 years, it was driven towards conservation. Actually, not even conservation, just prohibition. So, even beyond the coal industry, steel manufacturing, coke ovens, things like that, power plants, kind of been on the tip of the spear here too, to where not only, it wasn't a question of how can we do it and achieve the goal of economic activity and environmental protection, it was more of, you just can't do it.
Well, back to the Trump administration just momentarily. Again, there's been not only the halting of this rule from going forward, but there was a number of other operational kinds of standards, either out of OSM or EPA, and they're looking at all those. And if there was something believed to be real onerous, one that comes to mind is the one that come under OSM, the Stream Protection Zone. Which really would have stopped longwall mining in this state.
It would have, Chris. It would have. The way we characterized it, it was the final answer to the coal quandary that faced the Obama administration, because EPA's complications on the mine permitting process here in southern West Virginia had essentially stopped most surface mining, or the advancement of most surface mining. And I think the Stream Protection Rule was designed to take care of the other half of our production, or the majority in West Virginia's case of our production of underground mining.
Anybody around this business, anywhere, recognizes, understands that we're the leading underground coal producing state in the nation, and they also understand the significant contributions that longwall mining lends to that. We wouldn't be mining half of these underground seams if it wasn't for the economics you get that's involved, and the added safety factor from longwall mining. It'd be like taking away these extended cut machines. If you went in these underground operations and we're going to stop longwall, well, the mine would close because they just couldn't meet just couldn't achieve the cost models that are necessary today to produce in our regional and global economies. That's
right. And the mines were developed for longwall mining systems, and the initial investment that was made by the companies that deploy longwall mining systems, it's enormous.
Well, it's what sustains all the continuous mining production that we achieve too. It really does, because again, these mines just couldn't survive today, and within the regional or global marketplace. So, I mean, and the other thing I think is worth mentioning here is that right now the U.S. Department of Energy, under the leadership of former Texas Governor Rick Perry, and he's been around energy his entire life down there. What an appointment to that position, and he's managed the energy portfolio out of Texas, which had oil and gas and coal and was it lignite coal, I think, or subbituminous that they produce out of there, and Texas lignite.
Yeah, and they're a large consumer of Western coal.
And he and the president are working on a plan to try to sustain a certain percentage of baseload generation. Now that, as I understand it, that initiative also incorporates the existing nuclear fleet around the country. But here in West Virginia, of course, we only have coal.
Yes.
But it's designed, as I understand it, this plan's intended to try to try to keep a certain percentage of baseload generation that remains part of the nation's energy mix.
Yes, because I think there's a concern, and has been for a number of years, that you have two things. You have power markets that don't account for the assets that coal plants and nuclear plants provide, the resiliency and the stability that you're talking about, especially because coal plants and nuclear plants have fuel storage on site. A typical coal-fired power plant, Chris, as you know, can have anywhere from 90 to 120 days of fuel there at the power plant, so that if there is a transportation disruption, terrorism, a railroad derailment, the river freezes in a severe weather event, the fuel is on site, so the plant can continue to run. But I think the other thing that drives the FERC reliability rule is the understanding that individual states have deployed renewable portfolio standards, so that a certain percentage of renewable generation, wind and solar, has to be put in that individual state's electric grid. And that has led to market distortion. Because, as you know, wind and solar are not what we would call baseload reliable power, only when the sun shines, only when the wind blows. So to keep the grid stable and to keep the electricity turned on at the house and at the steel mill, you have to have backup baseload power in spinning reserve, ready at almost a moment's notice to pick the load up should a windmill stop turning or the clouds go over a solar panel. And that has led to severe market distortion, so that the assets, these large assets that are capital intensive, the coal-fired power plants and the nuclear plants, aren't being valued correctly, and in turn are actually being devalued. But the utilities, to maintain the grid and to maintain load stability, have to keep them running, even though they're not getting compensated for the fact that they're burning coal or that they're using their nuclear fuel, because the renewable portfolio standard has mandated the renewables dispatch first. And the market's not accounting for the base load power that has to be behind it. So,
well, and the other thing, I know there were a couple western states several years ago that established a very high renewable portfolio where they had to use, I think it was somewhere around 35% renewable power, which meant to these states and to these state coal producers, coal users, that came, when it came a certain time of the year, when that, the portfolio from baseload or from coal, reached a certain percentage, they couldn't take any more coal shipments for the remainder of the year.
That's exactly right. And
which goes to your point about the resiliency reliability of the grid. All that becomes threatened then when you back out that baseload generation to that degree.
And in those cases, Chris, where the coal plants had reached their allotted run time, the utilities didn't just run the windmills or let the windmills run longer. What they simply did, well, like you said, was idled their in-state coal plant and then went out on the marketplace to have fossil power, whether it was coal or natural gas, wheeled in across state lines from somewhere else. So, instead of your electricity coming from down the street, in those cases it now may have come from across the country, which implicates, again, stability and safety.
Well, it has to drive the price up.
And it drives the price up. You're going to the market and buying off the market almost on a real-time basis, depending on power load, depending on what the individual conditions are around the country.
Speaking of power prices, PSC recently made a presentation to our legislature about comparable energy prices, and I was really surprised to see, because I've been hearing about how our electric rates have gone up for both consumer and industrial here in the state, but we're still very competitive. Coal-fired generation is as competitive as any other fuel at this point.
It is, Chris, and it was it was remarkable to me. Now, the prices have gone up. I think everybody knows that. We look at our electric bills every month. But for a state that was so dependent on coal generation, 99% of our power comes from coal-fired generation, after billions of dollars of upgrades to our coal facilities and after closing 6 coal-fired power plants to come in compliance with the Mercury rule, West Virginia generation is still amongst the cheapest in the country. And I think that's a clear indication of how competitive coal can be in the power market if you take the regulatory burdens off of us so that we can compete. Because the price of coal, whether it's driven up by regulatory interference from an adverse EPA, or it's driven up by a draconian tax structure, that all gets passed on to the end consumer. And in the case of electricity prices, that's me, you, and everybody in the audience that pays an electric bill. So anything you can do to reduce the price of coal ultimately reduces the price of the power produced at the power plant. So it either lowers our bill, or in West Virginia's case, if you lower the cost of producing power at one of our in-state power plants, then those power plants can bid to markets outside of West Virginia and maybe sell power to New York or Michigan where it's wheeled across state lines. And any profit made from the sale of that power ultimately comes back to lower our prices as consumers here in West Virginia.
Well, and West Virginia still has one of the higher severance rates among our border states, if not one of the highest in the country. Certainly higher than Pennsylvania, where I don't believe there's any severance on coal. I think there's very, very little, if any, on coal that comes from Illinois. And Maryland and Ohio have just a couple of cents that they apply. I think it's 10 cents a ton or something in Ohio.
Yeah.
So, I know that has a big impact on the cost structure, and certainly places West Virginia coal at a disadvantage before it comes out of the ground.
That's absolutely right, Chris. And our biggest competitor in the electricity market right now is primarily the Illinois Basin, Indiana, Illinois, and the western part of Kentucky. And like you mentioned, those states don't have, if they have severance rates at all, most of them don't. They're not nearly as high as the state of West Virginia. So the power plant guys buying coal, that all plays in their decision of where the next coal delivery comes from.
Good. Well, I tell you, Jason, we're just about out of time with this segment of the program. It's gone by awful quick. Appreciate you coming on as regularly as you do to bring us up to date with some of the current events and to give us a little bit of your perspective on market situations.
Appreciate you having me.
Thanks so much, and we want to thank you for tuning in to our program today, and special thanks to the Library Television Network for putting this all together. Have a good day.